All right, last week we talked about context, interfaces, and scope. Where the context using the onion model was the outside of the onion model, and these were the things that influenced the project. Then we talked about interfaces, and these are the ins and outs of your boundaries of the system. And then we talked about scope, and this is really where we defined or how to define things that are in scope and things that are out of scope. We talked about soft systems versus hard systems, not software versus hardware, but soft systems really reflect these influencers, these things that are not necessarily well defined, versus the hard systems, which are going to be your software and your hardware. These are the things that are very well defined and are also a part of your product. Representing the soft system, the artifact that we looked at was the rich picture, and the rich picture really represents a collaborative effort among your stakeholders to define the entire system, specifically the soft system and the environment that it operates in. The context diagram also, in the same way, the rich picture represents the soft system. The context diagram represents the hard systems, and it used the airplane model or the airline model, where the project or the product was the airplane, and it showed the interfaces, for example, the fuel, the consumables, the baggage, the radio transmission. These things were events that provided context to the system, to the product. And then this also led us to making up an event list. It identified what events have to happen to the system, and what things are also a part of the bigger picture but are not a part of this project. For example, I think they gave the example of ticketing passengers. That is not that was out of scope. That's not a part of the project. But taking on fuel is in scope. That is a part of the project. Okay, so that brings us to Chapter 5, where we will be talking about scenarios. Now, scenarios come in all shapes and sizes. You have very formal, very heavy scenarios, down to things that are very light, that are basically placeholders for conversations. But we will be answering tonight the question of how will people use this product or service? And in this case, how will people use your software? Whether it is an application or website, we want to know the process that they're going to go through, because that's ultimately going to be something we have to develop. How do you do this? This is what we want to know. How do you go about this process, and what steps are involved? So I can tell you right now that you are at a disadvantage with your projects, because it's not, for the most part, for most of you, it is not a real project. You don't have real stakeholders. You're not going to have real workshop sessions. You're not going to have real interviews with stakeholders. So you may question yourself and say, how am I going to write a scenario? What do I know to write about? And that's really why I want you to select something that's already existing, something you can look at like a website, and that will drive the scenarios for you. For example, if you say, I want to do an online store, then you're going to notice the steps that you have to go through for that online store. But in the real world, if you're on a real project, these scenarios are really just going to, it's going to be a logical breakdown of work that you're going to see. And it's not really a method that you would choose. Here's the method I'm going to go through to select these scenarios. Now, as we go through this chapter, I'm going to refer to two projects that I've worked on in my past. One is, I've mentioned both of these to you, I think. One is when I was at Singular Wireless. I was we were developing systems for the sales channels, and the very first one that I was involved in was, I was a business analyst, and we were writing a new point-of-sale system for the retail stores. So I'm going to be referring to that one, and very shortly, in fact. I'm also going to be referring to when I worked with a restaurant chain headquartered here in Atlanta. the accounting system that we started writing for them. And so I'll be referring to these two as we move along. Now, in your book, it does list out a few ways that you go about identifying these scenarios. Again, it's not a real complicated task. These things really do come natural just in the course of your discovery. So when I was at Singular Wireless, and we had to start putting together some, scenarios, some requirements, just gather more information on the system that we had to build. I had stakeholders. Three specifically were had a store manager, a store sales associate, and a customer. So I had to interview all these different stakeholders. But when I focused on the store manager, I would say, okay, tell me everything that goes on in this store. And she said, well, we activate phones, we upgrade phones, we fix phones, we install phones in cars and vehicles, we provide customer service through the system to update people's billing systems or billing plans, and just general customer service work. And then of course we sell things like cases and cigarette light adapters, all those kind of things. I said, okay, good. Well, let's talk about activating customers. That seems to be really what drives revenue with the company. And she said, great, why don't you go talk to one of the sales associates and they can walk you through it. So I went to the sales associate. And first, before I get to here, I've mentioned, I think, 6 different things there. Each one of those at a high level could be a scenario. A scenario could be activate a phone. Another scenario could be sell a case for a phone. So yes, these could be scenarios at a high level. It might be very complex to have a scenario that high level, and it's just a matter of preference. So we have a term that we use, we call decompose, and we like to decompose this because it's a lot easier to write software around small things for small things. So when you take just a big requirement and say write software for it, it's very complex if you don't break it down. So back to where I was, I went out to the sales associate and I said, okay, you need to walk me through how to activate a phone for a client or for a customer. And I tell you what, I want you to start from the point that they walk in the door to the point that they walk out of the door. Now, what I just did is I went down to the paragraph at the bottom here where the right level of scenario to start with is a complete end-to-end story. So this sales associate, he walked me through everything that happens. He said, okay, the first thing we do, we greet the customer and we handwrite information. We look for name, address, phone number, driver's license number, social security number, and date of birth. Next thing we do, we enter that information into our system and we run a credit check. The next thing we do is we choose a phone, we choose a rate plan, and on and on and on. And so I'm seeing very logical breakouts of work here. I'm seeing first there's a collection of information, then there's a credit application, and then there's selecting price plans and phones, and then then there are other steps along the way that come after that. So immediately in my head, or I'm jotting down, I'm realizing, okay, let's just take, for example, run a credit check. That in itself could be a scenario. Again, it depends on how complex it is. It may be so simple that it doesn't deserve just being a simple scenario all by itself. So these are one of the things that you really have to evaluate at what level scenarios get cut. But the idea is a scenario is something that you can grasp what's happening and that it meets logical breakpoints. And maybe functional breakpoints. It can be a little wishy-washy. It doesn't necessarily matter, where you choose those breakpoints to be. You just want them to be small, and you want them to be as simple as possible, and to be logical. So what I did is I went through, if you look at the third bullet point here, known scenarios, problems with existing systems. So really what I did is I went into an existing store with an existing systems and existing processes, and I said, walk me through your systems. Now, the reason that we're doing or building this new point of sale system is because they were having problems with their existing system. In fact, they had 3 different systems, and the project I was working on was to bring it all into one system. So, we captured some of those scenarios by the first bullet point here, by the interview. It's also possible to capture some of these scenarios at high-level scenarios probably when you go into the goals workshop or any kind of workshop there. Another thing we did is we would sit out, and I say we, there were about 3 of us analysts working on different pieces of the system, would sit out on the floor, in a chair in the lobby, just watching what happens. Watch the interactions between the customers and the sales associates, seeing what kind of variances there are, seeing what they all do consistently. And that helps us to, provide context and scope to the new system and things that need to be considered. And then lastly, there are always templates and patterns that you can follow, and we'll get into that later on in the system, or I'm sorry, later on in the chapter. This next section that we're going to look at is going to seem a bit of a review for you maybe, talking about the context for writing scenarios. And really when we write scenarios and how we approach these, getting this information for our scenarios, we're going to do that through interviews, observations, and workshops. Again, this should be a bit of reviews from 2 chapters ago. The interviews, the advantage of an interview, a one-on-one interview, is you're going to have this flexible. It's going to be flexible. It's easier to get one person's time than a whole group. The downside of that is that it's going to be limited to that one person's perspective. Now, an observation, this is new. Your observation may offer an objective perspective, and don't discount that, because a lot of people believe that a business analyst should be really a fly on the wall, totally neutral, and in part, I do agree, especially when you're interviewing people. You don't want to necessarily inject your opinions. You don't want to sway them one way or another. You really just want to be neutral and capture. However, you're a smart person. You're intelligent. You've been hired to do a job, and as you work in a particular area, you're going to build up domain knowledge. And that's a good thing to have, and that is something that you bring to the table. So when you come in and you observe how something is happening, if you write something, if you notice something unique, write it down and capture it and bring it up for the next workshop or interview that you have with somebody. Of course, the flip side of that is if you are unfamiliar with a domain, you may totally miss out on something really important. So you certainly don't want to think that think more of your capabilities of an observer than you ought to. The workshops provide breadth of input. Again, I'm not going to go too much into this because we did talk about it a few weeks ago. One thing about workshops, they are very difficult to schedule. You have to do it way in advance. Oftentimes you don't have that kind of time. I remember one time when I was working for Singular, I was told, basically I was called up by my boss, and she said, can you start working on this tomorrow? And it was a brand new system, and I need you to start pulling in people. I need you to get the requirements. I need to start working on it tomorrow. It was Tuesday. We need to have this done by the end of the week. Well, that was absolutely insane. It was, basically my opportunity to put it back on her. And I said, well, if you want me to have all this done by the end of the week, I need this person, this person, this person, this person flown in tomorrow. They need to be here by noon. And she did it. So yeah, there are ways to make make things happen when you have powerful people to help you. But workshops in general are hard to schedule, and oftentimes you have to schedule multiple workshops, and people just don't, or your boss, your client, they may not have that kind of time. So that's one of the problems with workshops. Sometimes you can scale down the workshop and make that a little more flexible. All right, so in talking about workshops, we want to talk about the roles and the action list. And these are things that will bear in the workshop. Talk about swim lanes. This is an artifact that we use to help identify, the roles and the actions that the people are doing and how that relates to each other. And then we're going to be also talking about acting these scenes out in more of a role play model. So an example, I told you I would be going back between two different projects that I've worked on. Well, the second project that I worked on was working for a restaurant chain headquartered here in Atlanta, and they wanted to build a automated profit and loss statement. So really complicated, you'll see here in a minute, and they wanted us to basically pull together the requirements for it. They didn't even know if they wanted to build it. They just wanted to know how big is this thing going to be, and that was really what our task was to do. So we did organize a number of workshops, and how we did it, we had some introductory things. We played some games. Yes, we play games out there in the corporate world of doing this, and that really is intended to free up the creativity that everybody has. When you get them into a workshop, it kind of frees up, so you got to loosen that creativity. And what we did is we first said, okay, who is involved in this? And we got on the whiteboard and we just started saying, okay, we got restaurant owners, we have accounting people, we have vendors, and we just listed out all these people who are involved in the current profit and loss system statement, which is all manual to this point. And then we took, for example, the restaurant owner, or the what do they call it, a operator, the restaurant operator, and we said, okay, let's talk about all the things that the operator can do. And actually what we did is we gave everybody sticky notes. We gave them a magic marker and said, okay, what can they do? And so again, the operator, what can the operator do? And they just wrote them on a note and they stick them on a table. Wrote them on a note, stick them on a table. And me and this other person, we would walk around the table. It was a big, about a 30-foot round table, and we would walk around this round table and just pick up these notes, and we start putting them on the board, and just stick it to the whiteboard. And then after that, we started grouping these into logical groups, and here's what came out of it. Now this is after a couple of workshops with the same group of people, and many days of churning through this information, but here's what we came up with. In order to prepare corporate finance for the scalability for the next decade of growth, IT engaged in an extensive series of meetings with accounting departments. The goal was to determine how the profit and loss statement could be recreated, employing efficiencies, automation, and providing scalability. So that's kind of a mission statement for this exercise we were going through. And in Agile, we have these things called epics and themes. And epics are really big scenarios, and themes are these are qualities that go all throughout the scenarios. So epics, if you can imagine, are kind of like almost like silos. They're just big vertical scenarios, and then the themes would actually go horizontal across those. So maybe the first silo here, the first epic, the first big scenario is the operator P&L management system. Then the next one is the accountant P&L management system. Then the daily P&L, special P&Ls, reporting and integration. So these were kind of big areas that we knew that we had to address. And then we identified all the themes. People say, it needs to be intuitive. Well, not just intuitive for the operator, it needs to be intuitive for the accountant, it needs to be intuitive, the reporting needs to be intuitive, the special P&Ls, they need to be intuitive. Everything needs to be faster. So you see these themes, they would go horizontal. They would go across all of the epics. And the next item here, now this is where we talked about what the operator can do. And this is what's called a mind map. And how this works is we say the operator can, and then we had them list out verbs of what we didn't say what they can do, we just want to understand what the verbs are. So we can say the operator can audit, the operator can adjust, the operator can compare and transfer, calculate, correct. The operator can do all these verbs. You notice they're all verbs. And once we captured that, then we took it a next layer down. We said, okay, let's focus just on the view. Or actually, I think we started with enter. Let's focus just on what the operator can enter. And so then they went down and said, okay, they can enter transfers, unpaid expenses, wage accruals, and so on and so forth, all the way through here. So now you're seeing we're kind of peeling this onion down layer by layer, and until we finally get into some likely scenarios. So a likely scenario could be the operator can enter invoice dates. That could very well be a scenario. Some of the guiding ideas for improving the operator P&L visibility. Operators should be able to enter a portal and see the profit and loss progress over time, seeing all adjustments and allowing for easy communications with the accountant. Operators need to be able to see all transactions in real time, including those from the home office as well as transfers from other stores. So again, these are not things that we made up as the analyst. These are things that we extracted from the team, and then we showed these. Actually, the documents that you're looking at here were what we presented back to the stakeholders so that we could identify and get confirmation from them that this is in fact hitting the nail on the head, and it was. You know, we identified some of the tools that they need. We identified business development. This is a piece that they want to be able to use the P&L to help them grow their business. And then we did the same thing for the accountant. So you can see there's a lot of stuff, activity here, and there's also a lot of overlap because the accountant can also enter some of the same things that the operator can. And then we did the same thing for the profit and loss management for the accountant, guiding ideas for improving the accountant's P&L. So you kind of see the approach we took. It came from a workshop. You know, we start high level. Who are the players? What can they do? What activity is involved in all of this? And then let's pull together some of the major ideas, guiding ideas for this. Now the special P&L, these were whenever there's a grand opening, there's a special profit and loss, a remodel, another special kind of profit and loss, and these are the things that made those different. Operator change, whenever one operator changes mid-month to another operator, you have to create two P&Ls. We didn't have a time, or did not have enough time to get to the closing or to the year end. So again, we were kind of time boxed in this. So we wanted to state that yes, closings and year end, these are things that need to be done. However, we just did not have the time in the workshop to cover these, and something we'll have to do later on. Again, keep in mind our goal is to identify how big of a project this is going to be. And then this is regarding system integration. So you see the profit and loss statement. These are all the systems that we identified that feed into it. So you can tell this is a very complex project if they do endeavor to do this. Of course, it's all manual now, and you can see that what we've presented back to this organization is that, yeah, this is a significant project and probably going to be something that takes probably 1.5 to 2 years to pull off. So this leads us into really where a very high level scenario using swim lanes. So as you see, the swim lanes, these are the horizontal lanes that go across the screen. We've got 3 swim lanes. In the first swim lane we have the operator. The second swim lane is the system, and this is we're building the entire system, but this really kind of represents the system logic. And then this last one represents accounting. Now in some circles you travel, they would not like this. The idea is that there are actors, and actors are people, and people do things, and systems are not actors. I would not agree with that. I think, again, the whole purpose of requirements is to transfer information from the customer to the developer. And when you do that, the most effective way possible is what you really need to do. So if it is helpful to have the system as an actor, I'm personally okay with that, and I know that is also accepted as well. But you do run into a few purists who don't like that. So anyhow, what you see here is that typically you want to start, or I think what is typical, not necessarily that you have to do it, but you want to know where to start in this system. In this case, we're going to start with the operator. It's always good to start in the top left corner. Don't have to. It just makes logical sense for those of us who read from top to bottom and left to right. You want to start with, in this case, the operator collects data from P&L inputs. Now this may be system inputs, this may be manual inputs. And then the data loads into the operator side P&L. The P&L is marked last day and is finalized. So what's happening here is this is all happening, these 2 steps is all happening during the month, and then on the last day there's an action that happens. It's called P&L is marked last day and is finalized. Then it sends this file off to the system, and the system will go through a series of checks to make sure that everything is there and that there are certain balances and things are within ranges. And if there is an alert, then it sends it to the accounting department, and the accounting department will respond to the alerts in queue. So it will build a queue of these alerts, and then the accounting department will basically log into the system. Most likely will call up the operator and say, okay, let's work through this. And if they fixed it, then basically they will send it back to the operator. The operator will again finalize it, and then it goes back into the system, and then hopefully there are no alerts. And if there are no alerts, then the P&L statement is finalized, and then it becomes available for both the accountants to review it and for the operator to review it. So very high level. So this gives us kind of a model of what we're going to be building and the processes that we need to build. So this is, this is not. I don't want you to think that this is all kind of the process, and I'm having a hard time describing this. This is not the end case. This is a swim lane. This helps identify the models. Going back to these systems, these are all things that you will also use to create requirements, especially when you get into some of these mind maps. So when we talk about the accountant can, really what we're looking at, or what the operator can, those are kind of small things that they can do in the mind map, in the swim lanes. So those small things you looked at, that's what's happening here. When we say the operator can input information, they can input it in here. We talk about what the things the accountant can do. That's things that are happening in this area right here. When they view, they're viewing things here or here. So I hope that's clear. Again, it's not. It would be nice if you could say, well, first you do this, and then you do number 2, and then you do number 3, and then you do number 4, and that leads you to a nice set of requirements. Unfortunately, it's not quite that cut and dry. What you do is you build these artifacts, and you build these things that help you model what has to be built. And the swim lanes is a scenario building model for doing so. Next, we want to talk about scenario patterns, and we've touched on this a little bit already. So the first scenario pattern here is the whole life scenario, and this was the example I gave with the point of sale system when I said, okay, customer walks in the door and tell me everything they do until they walk out the door. A whole life scenario for this particular process. The next one might be a day in the life of. So if you're really looking for, this would probably would be more in the line of process improvement, but you may still find an opportunity for it in creating some system or some requirements for your software system. And that is basically just to follow the day in the life of the person whom you're building the system for, or who's going to be using the system. The transaction, operation, or task, and this is really where you're identifying almost in a stepwise manner something that is very transactional. So we're not talking about how to capture a activity between two people. We're not necessarily talking about that, but it's more transactional. This is something that would also be used in a manufacturing assembly line type of process. But you see here the picture that I'm depicting, you can see a credit card. It's going to the credit card is being handed to the sales assistant, who the information then is moving from through this process, the money that is information, moving to the bank and then to the data servers, and then looks like to the treasury, back to the data servers, back to the bank, and then back to the store where they get to claim the money. So it's, it's a very transactional process. And then data handling, and sometimes you'll create scenarios that have nothing to do with the people. They have nothing to do with the things that you see on the screen. A data handling scenario might involve, data always enters the system somewhere. So it could be that the data enters the system via a form, but then as it moves down to the database, especially in large enterprise organizations, that database may be all the way across the country. And it will go through multiple layers, and it will go through multiple transformations, go through multiple security points, and that data, as it transitions, someone's going to have to, at some point, especially when you talk about how the data is going to be stored and how it's going to be retrieved, you're going to be writing a data handling scenario. Now, honestly, I've seen some. I've never done one. But it's one thing that you may have to do. Just write a scenario for how the data goes from point A to point F and all the points in between. Your book gave some tips for discovering scenarios kind of related to what we talked earlier. Start with a normal happy day scenario. Now the happy day scenario is, again, I think we talked about it earlier. If everything aligns, on a good day, this is what you want to happen. This is what you really want to strive for. You want to keep each story or scenario as simple as possible. you want to identify, we're going to talk about different scopes. First, you want to have the normal transaction. What is typical? What is happy day? You can look at the day in the life of an operator. That's going to help. You want to move on to special cases. So I gave you the example of the sales associate, and they were running they're activating a phone. The first thing they did was they took in information from the customer, and then they went into, what was it? They ran a credit check. So when they ran the credit check, then the next step was to pick a phone and pick a rate plan and activate the phone. Well, what happens if the credit check came back with poor results? So there's a special case. You look at these things that can go wrong, and then you have to you have to figure out a variation or variance of how you're going to handle that. Also, you need to look for, and this is really more getting into how do you handle the data. There is this acronym called CRUD, C-R-U-D, and it stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. So these are all the things that you can do to data. All the things, there's only 4 of them. The only 4 things you can do to data is you can create data, you can read data, you can update the data, or you can delete the data. So these are things that sometimes can be rights that people have. Some people have the right to create data. Other people may only have the right to read the data, and that's also going to play into the scenarios that you write. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about are negative scenarios, and negative scenarios really refer to what can go wrong. And you can probably think, wow, that's pretty big, what can go wrong. As you're looking through scenarios, your stakeholders will help you define what is the appropriate level, because I would say it's almost impossible to capture everything that can go wrong. So you're really looking for the big ones. Your stakeholders will help you determine if you've gone to the appropriate level of investigating what can go wrong. Or they'll tell you, there's a lot more than what you have documented. So this is a part of that feedback that you need to capture with your stakeholders. But essentially, the things that can go wrong are going to be exceptions. And exceptions are things that will happen, can happen in the normal course of the user using the system, and you just need to be able to recognize those and have a scenario ready to handle that. For example, most of you are creating some sort of an online store. I assume you'll want to take a credit card. So what happens when that credit card is declined? If you don't handle it, the system will just freeze up and won't go anywhere, and it'll be a terrible customer experience. What you need to do then is create a scenario that create a process that handles and walks that customer through, ideally finalizing the purchase with another credit card. So that's an exception. The intentional threat, this is this is going to be people trying to hack into your system, either electronically, or it's going to be people trying to access the system, by maybe stealing a password, these sorts of things. And that's why you get systems that have profiles, user-based profiles that allow people, different profiles to do different things. So in my point-of-sale model, the sales associate can do some things, but the store manager can do all of that plus a lot more. So if someone were to steal a sales associate's password, they could only do what the sales associate could do, and certainly could not get into doing some of the financial manipulations that the store manager can do. So again, you got to think about these kind of threats that would be imposing on your system. And then lastly, the unwanted scenarios. And the unwanted scenarios, I find it easy to think about. The easiest way to think about these is taking the steps that you want the user to do and then reordering them, and you get an error. So I think the book gave the example of you want the user to take the gas cap off of the gas tank and then start filling it up with gas. But if you switch those two around and you started filling up with gas before you took the gas cap off, you'd have a literally an unwanted scenario. Well, these sort of things happen also in your system. For example, an online system where you have an online store, the unwanted scenarios, one certainly would be trying to ring out before you put anything in your cart. Well, the system should not even allow you to get to the point of ringing out if you don't have anything in your cart, because there's obviously nothing to ring out. So that's kind of what a unwanted scenario is about. And there are a lot of others, but just keep in mind it's a in the normal event of things, if doing the right things get crisscrossed, it may cause an unwanted scenario. And if it sounds like I'm kind of a little uncertain about this, it's not that I'm uncertain, it's just that it's not really clear. It's almost a bucket. The exceptions are when something goes wrong in terms of, like I said, with a credit card, it comes back with an undesired result. The intentional threat, that's pretty clear. The unwanted scenarios, it's almost like a bucket of if it doesn't fall into an exception, it doesn't fall into intentional threat, then it's going to be an unwanted scenario. That's another way to look at it. I would accept that as well. Sometimes having buckets can really help you out. Now, what's interesting, and a little bit of side note, your book got into this as well, is that software development is usually, and this is just kind of typical, 20% desired functionality, meaning that 20% of your time is going to be spent on the happy days of all these scenarios that you're going to be writing. 40% is going to be on the look and feel of the system. So the UX UI, that again, that means user experience, user interface. 40% of the time is going to be spent on that, because that's really where the user is focused. And then 40% is going to be on exception handling. So it's really going to be now the book ties exception handling to just the 40%, just to this part right here. But I would be willing to include intentional threats and unwanted scenarios as well, because you need to identify these things so that you can define ways to work around it. Now, a lot of these exceptions are going to come up by way of testing. So you get into the testing and you realize that there's some exceptions that are being thrown, and you need to determine how you're going to handle it. Means you need to go back to your requirements and start figuring this stuff out with the stakeholders or with the operators. So keep that in mind. And the reason I want to bring this up is when you are working with IT, and especially when you're getting into budgets, and especially if you're working with a not so mature development team or development organization, or maybe you're working with a contract team, you're going to be talking about, when people talk about systems that they want, they normally talk about this desired functionality. They'll talk a little bit about the UI, but they're going to be talking about what they want the system to do. And a not so mature development shop will estimate based on that. They'll estimate based on the desired functionality. They're going to estimate based on the GUI, the graphical user interface, and the user experience, but oftentimes they're going to leave out this 40% exception handling, and that's going to cause them to go over budget. So you need to make sure that if someone says, okay, it's going to cost you, I'll throw out a number, $400,000 to build this system for you, and what you want to do is make sure that this does include the functionality, does include the UX UI, and they're going to say, yep, it includes all that. And then you're going to say, well, how much percentage did you include for exception handling? And very often, especially if they are not a mature development shop, they're going to give you the deer in the headlight look, because they don't realize that, I mean, exception handling is something that you don't want to do, but it's always there anyway. It's always going to show up, and if they don't account for it in their estimate, then you need to bring it to their attention. So I bring this up for that reason alone. Even if you're not, if CIS is not your major, maybe it's your, again, it's your minor, this is something, a very important piece of information that you need. This and the 5-component framework, again, great takeaways, especially if you are not a CIS major. Now, the book brings up the Jackson's principle of commensurate care, which is basically how much money do we make, how much money do we pay to make some of these risks go away? How do we figure this out? So they use this formula, R equals P times D, where D equals the damage that the event or risk will cost. P equals what is the probability of the event happening, and then R is the required care. The financial damage multiplied by the probability of the event equals the required care. So I've got an example here that will help you help drive this home, I hope. Losing our data server is a possible event. If it goes down, it will take us about an hour to get it back online. The lost hour will cost the company approximately $80,000 in sales. Now, obviously this is a very large company if they do $80,000 worth of business in 1 hour. So let's take a deeper look and plug this into the formula that we just saw. The probability of our data server failing is about 2%. Okay, well, first of all, I'm just throwing out a number. That's actually a very, very big number for a data server. Really, when people talk about data server failure rates, we're talking about something that is 4 decimal points. So it would be, it would have a up rate of 99.999% of the time, or 9999% of the time. Certainly not 2%. But in this case, I'm just making the number big so that it makes for a better example. So the probability of our data server failing is about 2%. If we can prevent this problem for less than or equal to $1,600, we should do it. Now, where did that $1,600 come from? The $1,600 is 2% of $80,000. Well, now, when you look at this, you're going to say something's wrong here, because $80,000, if I can prevent $80,000 worth of failure or of lost opportunity for only $1,600, I absolutely should do it. Shouldn't be a question. If I could do it for $20,000, it shouldn't be a question. But what happened? And if this were the only risk that you were to face with your project, then you may be right. But what happens when you start identifying everything that can go wrong? You're going to get a list that's as long as your arm. And if you went through this exercise to address every risk, then you're going to find out that you have a budget and you can't go over your budget. And in fact, trying to throw money at everything that can go wrong is going to make you go horribly out of budget. So you have to have a system that helps you maintain balance and maintain your project within your budget. And this is the formula that they use to manage risk. Now, not all risk goes back to money. So a lot of it just goes back to effort, and certainly that's it can be used in the same formula, sort of. It really needs to tie back to a number, but you can see that if you had, say, 50 items that were potential risks in your enterprise project, and each one of them had a big price tag, there's got to be a way to identify the balance, and this is the way we do it. Now, of course, when you take this to your stakeholders, you might have to explain all this to them before you just throw something out there like this. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about is documenting scenarios. And there are user stories, there are storyboards, operational scenarios, and then use cases. So in the beginning of this chapter tonight, I told you that we're going to be looking at these scenarios, and there's different kinds. There are some that are very light, and then there are some that are very heavy, some that are less formal, some that are more formal. The user story is what we use in Agile, and it is very, very light, probably the lightest of them all and the least formal of them all. So the user story, usually we do this on a, let me see if I can zoom in on this. We do this on an index card. And basically it's the title's at the top, add item to basket, and it starts out like this. As a customer, I want, it's the formula as a, I want, so that. So as a customer, I want to add items to a basket so that I can review them later. Then it has a priority and an estimate. So the reason that we're doing this, and this is very light, so you obviously you don't have to be a CIS to major to say that. I don't see how anybody could build a system around that. Well, in Agile, like I said, we're very light when it comes to requirements, and we only do the number of we only do the amount of documentation that is absolutely required. So the idea of Agile is that everybody is co-located in one room, and everybody is working together, and so you've got the customer who's represented by a product owner, and he's in the room with you. So you've got the developer, the tester, the customer. They're all in the same room. It's a perfect scenario for developing software very quickly and getting exactly what you want. So what this is the customer writes this card and says, as a customer, I want to add items to a basket so that I can review them later. And he puts that up on the board. Let me get back to my controls here. And he puts that up on a board. I'm trying to bring that in. No, that's not working. Let me get back on track here. Okay, he puts that up on a board in the project room, something like a whiteboard maybe. And then it moves across from being on the left side, from being ready to work on, to then being worked on, and then to being tested, and then to finally being done. And the whole point behind this card is it's a promise to have a conversation, and that's all it is. And the only way you can really do that is when you are working side by side, the customer and the developer. And that's where these user stories come into play in Agile. So what happens is the developers, he just finished his last story, so he's ready to go work on another one. So he comes up and he pulls this card off the wall. He gets the product owner there with him and say, okay, tell me what you want in this basket. And so they have a conversation. They may get on the whiteboard and they may draw some pictures out. Maybe they make reference to some data schemas. But ultimately, it's just going to be a conversation, and there may be a mock-up that is going to take place here. But ultimately, it's just a conversation. That's what this card is to represent. It's a promise to have a conversation, and then they track these across the board as they get worked on. Now, what happens is you flip these over on the back side, and you'll see the acceptance criteria. And so what the product owner does, the customer does, is he flips it over and says, I will accept this story as being done as long as it meets the following criteria. And he lists out the criteria that has to be met. And so that also gives the tester something to use when they start writing their test cases. Okay, the next one is storyboards. And this is always kind of a fun one. So this first one here, you see someone who looks like they're walking up to a real estate yard sign. They look at it, they pull out their phone, you see them pulling the phone out of their pocket, and they bring up an app, and you can see they're going to take a picture of this code, this QR code. So, you know, you could certainly write these down in a stepwise fashion, but it's very meaningful simply to say, in this scenario, here's really what I'm looking at. That the person walks up, he sees the code, and he pulls phone out, brings up the app, snaps it. Very clear scenario. You see there's no words on here, but it tells very clearly what is happening. Another form of the storyboards is actually what we call storyboarding or prototyping on the computer, where you're actually creating mock-ups of the system. So you see that this looks kind of like a website here, except it's certainly not a website. It's all black and white and just very sketched out looking, and that's what it's intended to do, is to be sketched out looking, because we don't want people to get too caught up in some of the shiny things. So they use this to mock up you know, how the GUI is going to look, how the UI is going to look, and you know, certainly in this case depicting what some of these tabs can do. So that's a mock-up or a storyboard. Operational scenarios. Well, these, like I said before, are stepwise and really in more of a structure type environment. So examine program structure, plan slices to compute, make source code directory current, execute unravel, and again, this is when you get into a lot of computer scripts that have to run, then this is a good form to use. And you see it's you define done here, and then you move on, and then you define exit here, and again you move on. So you can see that these have kind of been progressing through layers of difficulty, or not difficulty, but completeness maybe is the right word. Then the next one here are use cases. Now use cases, these are what you're going to be writing. I'm going to be writing a few of these, and these are the real heavies. They really kind of capture end to end what's happening, and they're almost meant to stand alone, so that I can write this use case, I can take it, I can hand it to someone and walk away and never have to talk to them, and they're going to know exactly what to do. That's sort of the idea of a use case, is that it's complete in everything that needs to be done. And what you'll see here is you talk about a goal, you know, some of the roles that are involved in this scenario, and then you want to identify the main or the happy day scenario. Then the variations, some exceptions, preconditions. Now the preconditions, obviously this is what has to, the state that your system needs to be in prior to starting the scenario. Now keep in mind that system may not be the product. It may be, you know, the larger idea of system. In the case of my point of sale system, it was the retail store. Customer walks into retail store, says I want to activate a phone. That's a precondition. Guarantees, these are post conditions. These are the things that must be true or must be the case when this scenario is over. Then you can have other information like stakeholders and their interest, local qualities and constraints. You know, there's a couple things you can add to that. So that's kind of a template. Here's actually a real use case. Primary actor is a purchaser. The personal, this is a financial stock buying thing. Personal advisor. The level, user goal, again, some of these things are kind of unique to whoever was writing this. But you've got your precondition here. The user already has the PAF, which is the personal advisor finance package. User has it open. The minimum guarantee. So again, these things are kind of unique, but I want to get on down to this main Success scenario. Purchaser selects stocks to buy over the web. The path gets the name of the website. Path opens up the web connection. So you see they're going through these systems, or going through these steps. And then they have these extensions. Now this may be more of the exceptions. So I think you get the idea, and the model that I want you to use is actually the one that they use in your book. You can follow along with that. Feel free also to follow the ones that I sent in the requirement documents, especially the one about the scenarios. All right, we're starting to close in on the end here. Validation. And again, in everything you do in building systems and discovering requirements, you want to go through this exercise of feedback. So, tips for validating feedback according to your book. The first one here is, let me see if I can get a closer look at this one. Let me see, I'm sorry. Is the use case title a functional goal or something to do? Does it show action to it? And again, these are not. Let me back up a little bit. The feedback here is on the use case, because that's the most complex and most complicated one that we've talked about. But in all the scenario types, you want to be able to go through this feedback session from your stakeholders. In this case, it is the use case because it is the most complex one of the scenarios. Is the primary role identified, or roles? It can be multiple roles. Is the main story told simply and definitely with no ifs or buts? Again, we talked about how you can have large, high-level scenarios. It's important to break those down into simple scenarios that can be easily understood and easily defined. Identify what can go wrong. Have you done that? Have you covered all and it's important here to mention the word important, because it's not are all the exceptions covered, but are all the important ones covered. Are the necessary preconditions stated? So you got to know what state the system is in before you start your scenario. Are the success and failure guarantees defined correctly? So coming out of this, what was a success? What defines success and what defines failure of this scenario? And are any necessary constraints and qualities stated? And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the qualities and constraints chapter. All right, guys, I think that is about it. So take 15 minutes, and I will meet you after the break online. Thanks a lot.